Hello, John.
Hey,
Hey, how are you today?
I'm doing well. This is the part where we pretend that we haven't been talking for the last 15, 20 minutes, but
That is
that's
true.
cool.
And it's also what we call pre-show banter. So if you're listening right now, you can skip ahead 10 minutes to the webcast.
Yep.
So this
So,
is for all the people who tuned in early. And thank you for getting here early.
yeah. Don't you guys have jobs? Like, I always worry about that. Like, we sometimes start our webcast like a half an hour early, and we have like 15, 20 people that dial in like literally 20, 30 minutes before it's supposed to start. Just- That's exciting that they're that into it, but man, I
Yeah.
guess I gotta have jobs.
So, John, what do you have on the screen right now? And for all the people who aren't looking, you should probably look.
So this is something that we ginned up. It's called Cubicles and Compromises. It's based on Dungeons and Dragons, and we started doing it as tabletop exercises for our company. And the reason why is anytime we traditionally did incident response tabletop exercises, it was really 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 painful. I don't know. It's like listening to Yanni in your grandparents' car, when you're driving across the state or something. It was just horrible. And you would have these arguments that would break out. Like you would say, okay, so we've got malware on one of your workstations. Then you have some desktop support guy say, well, our AV would catch that. I'm like, well, no, it it wouldn't. Yeah, our antivirus actually catches viruses. I mean, it's in the name. It's called antivirus. And feel like we do this all the time. We do pen testing. It's not that hard to bypass antivirus. It just let's just assume let's do the land of make believe that it can bypass it. Like, well, no, you're lying. I'm like, well, what do you want from me? And they're like, well, prove it. So then in the middle of this tabletop exercise, I have to bypass their antivirus engine, which isn't hard, but it takes time. And then when you do it, they get mad and they're like, well, you got to submit that to Symantec right now. It's like, oh, geez. So to bypass a lot of those, we kind of gamified it a little bit. And we introduced the idea of a 20-sided dice because we like to make executives incredibly uncomfortable. There's nothing like going into a meeting with a bunch of suits and you whip out the 20-sided dice and you set it on the table and they like kind of like reel from it. It's like and then we start working through the exercise. And what's awesome is basically what you do is you work through a scenario, and anytime an action is made by the defenders, right? Like if you say, well, we're going to send help desk to go look at that workstation to determine whether or not it is compromised. Well, do you have training in that? If they say yes, they get a +1 modifier. Do you have procedures on how someone's supposed to do that? If they say yes, they get a +3 modifier on the roll. And if they roll 10 or below, the action fails. If it's 11 and above, the action's successful. And what's awesome is it takes all of those arguments about what security technologies would and would not do, and it completely takes them off the table. And it's also neat to see how executives get involved and they start getting like really into the game. Like they're trying to take an action. You can see that they're emotionally invested, and then you start rolling the dice and they're like jumping around, hooping, hollering, they're high-fiving each other, drinking Red Bull. They got their ties around their heads, Rambo style. And it completely changes the whole tabletop scenario. And we also have some injects in our blog post of what we do. And you have an IT master or the IT guru master, the incident response master. That's the equivalent of the dungeon master that's walking through the scenario. And we can drop in these different injects. And all of these injects are actually based off of uh, things that have happened in the middle of incidents for me over the past 18 years. Attacker posted the incident data on Pastebin. You do that, and it fundamentally shifts the entire incident. It's no longer just find the malware, remove the malware. Now you have something political that you're working in tandem with the actual technical aspects of the incident. Bobby the intern kills the system you're reviewing because this happens a lot. Like, the server won't be working because the server's offline and it's isolated, and you're doing incident response, you're dumping the memory, dumping the hard drive, we're working so hard on it. And then Bobby the intern's like, well, the web server's not working, let's go reboot it. And then all of your forensics evidence is now gone. Black box pen test hired by the CEO. Oh, we actually had this happen 2 weeks ago, where we were pen testing and the security team didn't know about it, but the CEO did, and they they really should have talked to each other because it escalated very, very, very quickly. And the CEO had to step in and say, no, this is actually an attack by a company that we hired to come in. Legal takes your only skilled incident handler into a meeting to explain the incident. And I talk about this in 504 all the time, where legal can suck up your entire life. Lead handler's wife has a baby. This happened to me. My wife had our first daughter, and in the middle of an incident, And I had to go to the hospital because my wife's giving birth. And while my wife is giving birth, I keep getting phone calls, right? And eventually I just shut off my phone, and my boss was all mad at me for that. And they made me come in right after my wife had given birth to my daughter, and I had blood all over my shirt. Jason, you and I have talked about this, like the miracle of childbirth and just how unbelievably gruesome
It
it actually
is.
is. And I was wearing
Is
a white t-shirt, and I had blood everywhere. I even had it like on my glasses because I wore glasses at the time, and a big like splatter of blood across my up across my chest. And I went into work, and basically the manager of this particular part of Accenture that I was working at was offended. He was like, "How dare you come into here completely dripping with blood from head to toe and gore?" And I had to explain my wife just had a kid, and I don't know, that was fun. Indiana Hamel, we had this guy that was really, really weird. We always called him Indiana Hamel because he wore like bright white tennis shoes, and he wore this fedora like Indiana Jones. And he had these white shoes, and you would catch him painting his white shoes because he didn't want to buy new white shoes. So he would go through and get those like Rit or whatever, and he would repaint his shoes all the time. And he had like Xena Warrior Princess cutouts that were life size in his cubicle. And in the middle of an incident, we had the server completely taken apart. The server was running. We had the top of it off. He just walks in and just pulls the memory from a running server, just pulls it and then puts it back in. And he goes, "Yep, sometimes you got to reseat this memory." And then he just walks off. And in the distance, we're like, "Doo, doo, 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 doo." It's awesome. Unrelated denial of service attack breaks out, and we have some additional ones that we've added into SANS 504 for our tabletop exercise. So that's the idea of cubicles and compromise. And like I said, my favorite thing in the world is seeing executives get really uncomfortable with this idea, but they warm up to it because that idea of randomness, instead of blaming someone or saying you suck or this technology sucks, you introduce randomness to it, takes that completely off the table, and people can have a good time.
John, for all the people who are just tuning in, what John just did is went through Dungeons and Dragons, but meets cubicles and compromises. So if you get a chance, go to, where's it at? Black Hills blog?
Yep, blackhillsinfosec.com, or you just Google cubicles and compromises, and we are literally the only hit. We got that locked down.
And so, John, you're getting ready to teach in London next week. Where else after that?
I have no idea. I think it's London, and then it's Sansfire. I don't know. I just go where Lisa, my handler at the SANS Institute, tells me to go.
And you just got back from Orlando last week, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I'm in the Bourne movies. I get a phone call. "We need you to be in San Francisco tomorrow to teach." Okay, I'll be there. Got to go get my fake passport, my money, all that stuff.
So you live in, for the people who don't know, where you live in South Dakota?
So yes, I live in South Dakota. So if we take a look at the weather, in South Dakota and what exactly is coming up here, we actually have a winter storm warning, and we're supposed to be getting, I've been watching this all like day, because we're supposed to be getting 1 to 2 feet of snow tomorrow, which is awesome. And I have to fly out on Saturday, so I hope that works out all right. But yeah, we're supposed to get, well, here now it's now 5 to 10 inches with localized amounts of 13 inches in the northern Black Hills, and that's like where I live. So yes, I'll be digging out of snow over the next couple of days.
And with that, we're going to go quiet for the next 30 seconds and officially start the webcast at 3:30. Thanks, John.
You bet.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Hitting Every Rock on the Way Down, a look back at 15 years of pen testing with John Strand. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is John Strand, SANS instructor and course author. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded And a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John.
Thank you so much. All right, so we wanted to have a webcast that was a little bit different. There's a ton of webcasts that are very technical in nature. I don't really talk much about tech in this webcast, but there's also a lot of webcasts where the presenter talks about this awesome thing that they did. And that makes sense because as human beings, we always want to put our best foot forward. We want to be able to say, look how awesome we are to a large group of people. And I wanted to do something that was fundamentally different about that. I wanted to talk about all the painful things that have happened in my career doing network pen testing, teaching for the SANS Institute, and also running Black Hills Information Security. And I know without question that some of this is going to be used against me because there's people out there that are just trolls. And they'll be like, well, I can't believe he did that. Well, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about happened like 18 years ago. And I want to talk about how these mistakes I made, some of them a long time ago, helped fundamentally shape the way I approach penetration testing, how I actually approach computer security as a whole. So like I said, it is a weird presentation in that regard. This presentation is brought to you by SANS 504, which is a bit strange because I'm the lead author of that class now, and I teach it all the time. And I'm literally giving you a presentation about all the mistakes that I've made. So basically this whole presentation is, I suck, come take my class. And I guess that's the marketing message that we're going with for here. But I do think it's important to have some people in their career where they're more or less comfortable in their own skin. Talk about some of the mistakes that they ran into. And this is a quote from years ago: to become truly adept at laughing at yourself, you have to practice on others first. And I want to give everyone that's going to be at this presentation an opportunity to laugh at me. But if you take the whole gist of me telling these really painful stories about all the horrible things I've done as I'm an idiot, you're probably right. You're probably getting the right thing out of that, but you're probably getting a different message than what I actually want you to get out of it. The main message I would like people to get out of this is to avoid a lot of the mistakes that I made as I came up in my career as a pen tester, as a business owner, as an instructor with SANS Institute. So you can avoid those mistakes and make brand new mistakes. I always get a little bit uncomfortable when people come up to me and like, yeah, I saw that presentation and you talked about, not putting your finger in an outlet, and I did that and it really sucked. And I'm like, my presentation just completely failed. It's not jackass. I'm not doing and showing you all the horrible things I did so that you can then replicate those. You should not do these things. So a lot of these things are mistakes that I've made and problems that I've ran into over the years. So let's get started at the very beginning. So first, my coding skills are horrible. And I am so good at being a very bad coder. I can actually look at other people's code and I can be like, this code is awful. And people will ask why, because this is literally something that I would write. This makes sense to me. So therefore it must be really bad. So I started a long time ago, back in 2000, and I was working with the Department of Interior with Accenture. And sometimes Accenture gets a little bit uncomfortable whenever I mention them. They're like, well, geez, you can't say that you're working with them. We want that removed. But this was 18 years ago. And they hired me right out of college. I had a political science degree. And they were like, political science degree, that's great. You're going to learn to code Java. So I went off to learn Java at St. Charles. And then they brought me back for more training in Denver. They're like, well, now you got to learn JavaScript. I'm like, oh, okay. So I had like 2 weeks to learn Java and then 2 weeks to learn JavaScript. And then all of a sudden I show up on site and they're like, you're now a people code and C. And it's like, So I literally had just, a handful of days to try to learn languages. And if anybody here works in coding in a language, you know that that's just not possible. That's just not how coding language works, especially if you have a political theory degree. So I started in this mix of C and people code. Yes, they actually called it people code at PeopleSoft. And, I could make things work. And that's ultimately what Accenture looks for, is they look for people that you can drop into the deep end and they actually swim. And then they keep those people. The people that can't, they just move them on to other things and eventually they moved on. At least that's the way they did it 18 years ago. They've improved a tremendous amount since then. So they don't do this as much as they used to. It was bad time back in 99, 2000 for a lot of big five consulting firms. But I could write stuff that would functionally work, and it would work enough so that my boss would say, yep, it works. And then we put it into production. And then what was beautiful about that is whenever I was working in software, if I got it to work just long enough where it made it into production, it became magically someone else's problem. whenever it crashed. It didn't work well. It was not robust. It was just so bad. And I know that it was bad. And I knew it was bad at the time because I remember writing code and thinking to myself, I have no freaking clue at all what I'm actually doing at all. And everybody around me kind of had that same feeling, right? They were like, John's really bad at code and he has no idea what he's doing. But I did have one skill. I had the ability to where I could write exploits. I would take Dr. Watson reports. And back in the day, you didn't have to worry about address-based layout randomization. You didn't worry about dep. You didn't worry about canaries protecting return pointers. You didn't worry about any of those things. And you could take these Dr. Watson reports and you could literally take the information in it and you could be like, well, the offset to the return pointer is 150 bytes. And then you would rewrite the return pointer back into a specific address because you didn't have ASLR, and then bang, you get shell on a system. And I knew how to do this trick, right? And it was like the only trick I really knew how to do. And I felt at the time that it made me look like an absolute hacker badass. Like I could do this thing that no one else could do, but it was really because I had read a paper online and followed the instructions, and then I just replicated it. Not having any idea about memory management, not having any idea about how to write code properly. I just knew how to take this crash dump and then turn it into a functional exploit, which was no mean trick at all. It was pretty easy to do. And I kind of started getting a big head about it. And I'm going to talk more about this as we progress throughout the slides. But I started getting very egotistical about my security abilities and what I thought I knew how to do and what the reality of the situation was in information security as a whole. Now, where to start in my story is really hard. I was spending a lot of time this morning trying to figure out where I should start this entire presentation. Like, how did I get into computer security? How did I get into SANS? How did I get into IT? And I mean, there are literally so many different stories to talk about that. Because if you're somebody that's been doing this for a while, you have 19 or 20 years or 30 or 40 years, there's just so much to go off of. And it's interesting how I actually got started into IT at Accenture. I remember I was sitting in a room at the business school, and I was a political science major, and I was in charge of IT and like pro audio services for the campus. And they had this business fair, and I went to all these tables and was helping everyone get their power set up, get their internet set up, things like that. And I'm wearing like cargo pants, and I got like, like wire cutters and crap like that. And I go to the table with Anderson Consulting and Accenture, and I helped them out. They had a problem with their computer, and I was able to solve. I honestly can't remember it. And they said, you should put in a resume. And I thought they were joking with me. I thought they were just kind of making fun of me because they were dressed in suits. I wasn't. And I kind of took offense. He's like, look, we're not offending you. We're not making fun of you. You should really put in a resume. And I did. And I literally had to go back and write that resume. Then I got to the first of like 4 interviews with Anderson Consulting and Accenture, and they have a rigorous vetting process. I think there was like 150 people interviewing, and they were only hiring 2. And it was funny because my first interview, I sat down and the gentleman's looking at my GPA and all my grades, and he saw that I had horrible grades for half of like my collegiate career. And then all of a sudden I got like 4.0s after that. He's going through the resume and he asked me, well, is there anything that's happened in your college career that you may regret? And I say, well, I was busted for smoking marijuana in college. And I remember he was chewing on a pen, and he inhaled the pen, and it actually gagged him because he was surprised to hear that answer. And he goes, well, I'm sure that you would not do that again. And I'm like, actually, I would do that again. I would go back in time and I would do that exact same thing again, and I would get busted. And he was kind of shocked by that answer. And I said, from that point on, I made a mistake. I found my wife because she was actually busted with me. And if you look at my grades, from that point forward, I literally had a 4.0. It was one of those things that fundamentally changed the way I approached my life. I was actually kind of worthless as a human being. And I found this girl that I really liked who we got busted together. And I decided I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. And there was no way I could do that if I was smoking pot and all that crap in college. And it changed my life. And he liked that answer. And I didn't have a perfect 4.0. I think I had like 3.5 GPA. And he really liked that answer. And Accenture also liked that answer. And I learned afterwards why. Accenture, whenever I worked for them, they like to see people that can encounter adversity and they can overcome that adversity, and they don't get locked down into saying, woe is me, my life sucks because this bad thing happened to me. So I owe Accenture a tremendous amount in my life, and it actually kind of shades forward into how I look at Black Hills information security as well, because you'll see that as a theme. Encountering something bad, learning from it and moving on is a trait that is absolutely necessary if you're going to be an effective pen tester. So flash forward, I'm hired by Accenture and got on the security team, which is a whole nother story in and of itself that actually involves young Ed Scotus when he had more hair. And they started me on my first test. Now, I'd gotten on the security team because I kind of knew how to write an exploit. And they said, we want to scan everything. And this was part of the Department of Interior, and all this information is available online. Not the specific story, but Cobell versus Norton, Cobell versus Babbitt, Cobell versus the Department of Interior was one of the largest class action lawsuits in history. In fact, it still may be the largest class action lawsuit in history. And I started at Department of Interior working on that gig, and there was a freak out, right? They had hired some pen testers to break in and quote unquote steal money from Native Americans to prove to the judge in the case, Judge Lampert, that that was possible. And they did it. And they did it with panache and style and sophistication. So they needed to stand up a security team immediately. And I guess I was it. And the first thing that they told me was, we want you to scan everything. And I was like, would you please qualify what everything means? And at the time, like we're talking like 2001, Department of Interior still had publicly routable IP addresses down to their desktops. There was no firewall, there was no NAT. It was all right on the internet. It was all raw, and it was real. So they said they wanted to scan all IP addresses, and they said you need to scan 0.0.0.0 to 255.255.255.255. And I'm like, oh, what the heck? And I was using the software package. It was originally created by the Wheel Group. It was one of the first security software vendors. Back in 95, 96 is whenever they first started kicking up. They eventually were bought by Cisco. And they had this scanning package that's a lot like Nessus called NetSonar. And it would scan looking for vulnerabilities, kind of your first idea of a vulnerability assessment scanner. It was all written in Python. It was pretty cool. But it was nothing like we have today. So we just basically started scanning away the entire internet. And I thought that was weird. Like I was like, we're scanning the entire internet. And I remember one of my bosses at the time was like, well, we'll find all the security vulnerabilities and we'll let people know what the security vulnerabilities are. And like in his head, he thought we were going to scan the entire internet, and we were literally going to send emails to people saying, hey, you're vulnerable to this particular vulnerability in this attack. And that was insane. And I honestly didn't know what a net mask was. I didn't know what an IP address range was. I had no idea at all. I was scared, right? I literally read Hacking Windows 2000 Exposed the night before I set off to try to, scan the internet looking for vulnerabilities, because I thought somehow I'd read this book and it would tell me about how to hack into systems. And it did, but it didn't talk anything about using a vulnerability assessment scanner to scan the entire internet. So that made me uncomfortable, right? But my manager was like, no, you're going to do this. You're going to do this. And I remember we let it run for like 2 days. And my manager asked me, he goes, how's the scan going? And I'm like, well, we've scanned effectively 1% of the entire internet, which was a massive amount of IP addresses back in the day. But we basically decided to kill that scan. And as I sat down with some of the systems administrators and network administrators to try to figure out what had gone wrong, because that was my mandate. My boss's boss was like, go figure out why this thing is running so slow. I remember sitting down with some amazing people, Martin Brunig and a bunch of just amazing people that just completely changed my life, Pete Tokum, and they sat down and they were patient with me, right? And as soon as I showed them what we were doing, they didn't laugh at me. They didn't point fingers. They didn't say, hey, you're being an idiot. They basically politely and quietly explained to me what an IP address was, how many IP addresses there were, what classless interdomain routing was. And because we were in the middle of this very high stress situation, I remember all the lessons that they taught me were like tattooed on the inside of my brain because it was very high stress. And I learned from that. When I went back to the boss and said, we're not doing this because scanning the entire internet is illegal. I remember there was a tremendous amount of pressure, and I felt like I was going to be fired for pushing back, and I wasn't. So I went back and I learned what my mistake was, and got some information from some people that were amazing at helping me understand what was going on. And I was able to fight back, and I was able to tell my manager at the time, no, we aren't doing this, or at the very least, I'm not doing it. And I think that was watershed for me, because I didn't allow myself to be pressured, and I was able to take risks and push back. And all the people that I work with were supportive of me in that. So this is stupid, right? I'm an instructor with the SANS who've been teaching for a long time. And to sit down and say, when I first started, back in 2000, and I made this simple, stupid rookie mistake. I'm hoping it kind of gets people to the point where they understand where people come from. Like if you're looking at somebody like Ed Scotus, if you're looking at somebody like Hal Pomerantz, none of us ever started out knowing absolutely everything. I mean, we all started out making incredibly dumb moves. And I think it's important for people to know that, because we get into this paralysis if we're new, and we're so afraid of making a mistake and losing face in front of our peers that we just don't do anything, because we're so terrified about being embarrassed. And with me, I think that part of my brain was shut off. I wasn't worried about being embarrassed. I was much more concerned about screwing up in such a way that would actually lead me to go to prison. So we get a lot of people, after that, I was going to start reading on security. I realized that these hacking exposed books, while they were interesting, they weren't actually helping me in my day-to-day job. And they're good books. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think that they're fantastic books. But where I learned the most moving forward from that particular portion going on was I didn't try to read the hacking books. I actually read man pages. I actually read the user manuals for all the software that we had installed in our organization. And then I went through and I installed absolutely everything I could, from Exchange to Active Directory, absolutely everything, because I realized that that simple network mask IP address range mistake, that was basically because I was deficient in IT understanding. It wasn't that I didn't understand how to hack, which I clearly didn't understand how to hack, but it was more a problem that I didn't understand IT. And it kind of put away trying to be a hacker, because at that point I realized that I was not a hacker. I was basically one step away from being an intern, and I was put in a tremendous, weird position to start doing security for the world's largest class action lawsuit for the Department of Interior. That was insane. And I basically realized that I had to understand how technology worked. And I started installing everything. I started running packet sniffers. I was installing new operating systems all the time, blowing up machines, and everyone was very patient, and they were helping me because I was able to sink in, and I was able to immerse myself in this idea of computers, and not just playing video games computers, but actually understanding how enterprises work. The other thing that I had going for me is the Department of Interior was actually shut down for something like 9 months or 12 months as part of this legal case. And I literally had a full Active Directory infrastructure where I could practice my skills. I could reinstall software, install software. I could crash things. I could burn it to the ground. And people would get frustrated, but they'd be like, oh, I guess we're not going to be playing Team Fortress Classic or Total Annihilation because John, crashed the domain controller. We need to reboot it. But I had a large-scale enterprise in the government that wasn't being used. And I realized that I was incredibly lucky. And instead of playing video games and stuff, I spent a tremendous amount of time reading man pages and manuals. And I kind of learned the entire power that came with reading the fine manual and being able to sit down and have a conversation with the systems administrator on that application. And there was a lot of respect that they gave to me simply because I could now speak to how their program actually worked rather than just talking about vulnerabilities. So don't be a hacker. Right? Write lots of bad code, throw it away, rewrite it, and write it again. And you're going to start moving in the right direction. But you just can't start out by trying to be a hacker. You've got to understand how technology itself works. And reading those manuals is a huge step in the right direction. Now, very quickly, I went from knowing very little about anything to the point where I was now a quote unquote expert in security. And I realize now, looking back on it, that I made that transition far faster than I ever should have, because even as I felt like I was getting my feet underneath me, looking back at myself when I was in my early 20s, I realized I was a complete idiot. Still, now I had some knowledge, and that little bit of that knowledge was a very, very dangerous thing, because I had opinions and people would listen to my opinions. They wanted me on calls. They trusted me. And I've always had this ability to communicate with a sense of authority, even if I'm wrong. And I realize now that that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's just something that I do have. I found out about this because we had an intervention. We had a security team, and we have some people that I'm still very good friends with to this day. And they basically kind of pulled me aside, and they're like, "Dude, you're becoming a monster." They're like, whenever I'm talking to John Strand, like the person, he's fine. But as soon as you move into management meetings, as soon as you actually start talking about computer security in a professional way, they called me John Strand CISSP or John Strand GCIH. And it was just kind of their funny way of differentiating between these two different people that I was. And that wasn't that it was two different people. It was just, you know, you have a personal persona whenever you're talking to your friends, and then you have this professional persona. And a tremendous amount of that persona was actually driven by fear. You know, the more confident I was, the fewer questions people asked, and the less likely my ignorance on certain topics would actually come to fruition. And I realized that in the process of doing that, through the intervention of my friends and people that are still friends of mine today, I had become an ass, and I I didn't get defensive about it. I was actually hurt um, for a while, and I realized that I shouldn't be angry at the people that were willing to tell me that I was becoming a monster. Because you have friends, they'll let you self-destruct, but your really good friends will actually tell you you're being a jerk, and I was in fact being a jerk. And I try to do better, right? You know, and it's a lot harder to make that transition than it actually seems, because in corporate America, and I think it's specific to America, if there's any weakness that is ever perceived by management, if there's any weakness that's ever perceived by other people in IT people are not gentle. If they feel like you do not understand something, they will tear you apart. So you constantly have to put on these airs that you know more than you do, because if they see any weakness, there's blood in the water and they're going to come after you. But I'm here to tell you it's okay. It's okay to say, I don't know. Don't try to make up an answer. Don't try to pull something out of thin air. It's okay if you're not sure to say, I don't know. And this is literally something I tell myself all the time. I just got done with a call, an IANS customer, and they were asking me about a whole bunch of different products from Symantec. And you know, there's that John Strand CISSP, John Strand GCIH in the back of my head that constantly wants to crawl out and say, yeah, I know what that product is. It's crap, even though I've never touched it. It's hard to admit that you don't know. But as you get older and as you get more comfortable in your skin, it's easier to say, look, I've never used that product. I've never administered it, never worked with it, never touched it. It's never come up in any of my tests. And you have to be okay with actually saying that. And I've seen a lot of people in this industry that do the exact same type of trajectory. We've even had some interns at BHIS that do the same thing. They get really smart, and they're like, 19 years old, and now they think they know absolutely everything. And as you learn more, you realize that you do not know everything at all. The final thing I would leave with on this slide is, just because people agree with you does not make you right. You should always strive to be right, not strive to perceive to be right. And those are two different things. A lot of times human beings will be wrong, and they know they're wrong, but they've already taken a position and they cannot back down from that position because they're afraid of a loss of face in front of other people. And they'll hold on to a bad idea or a bad position or an incorrect belief simply because they don't want people to understand that they don't know what they're talking about. So yes, don't let the power turn you into a monster. And whenever you're in security, trust me, you're going to get power. Things will crash. You will be blamed. I'm sure that this has happened to a large number of you. You start a scan on Monday, something crashes on Friday. Whose fault is it? It's always yours every single time. And this is where that confident persona starts to evaporate whenever you're a tester. Because if you cannot answer definitively why something went wrong, it is still your fault. It's kind of like you're guilty until you're proven innocent. And that's unfortunate that that's the way that this goes. And I'd like to think that IT is getting better, but I don't see it getting better. Like whenever I work with organizations, they always like to blame someone for something that had happened. And there's always that concept of doubt. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that if I can quickly blame somebody else, then the implication of blame is no longer with me. And the security team makes a great scapegoat. And the reason why is we've actually crashed things as security professionals, right? I mean, if I asked how many people that are on the webcast today have actually crashed a system at some point in their career, I would say that there would be a high percentage of people that have crashed systems at some point in their career. Now, how do you actually deal with this, right? So I remember the first time I crashed. Well, I didn't crash. The first time I was blamed for crashing a system, and I didn't actually crash it. It was actually a domain controller that was clustered between two systems. And I remember we did scan on Monday, and then on Friday the systems went down, and there were two systems. They were clustered, and I remember investigating. Like I was going through my scan profile, trying to figure out what had went wrong, and I realized that I wasn't getting anything from the vulnerabilities that were discovered that would answer why the system had crashed. So I went to the servers themselves, and I started looking at the event logs of these two systems and trying to piece together what had happened. Now, I honestly didn't know that much about what I was looking at, but I started watching the event logs, going through them just line by line whenever things started going south, and then working backwards. And there was a lot of event logs. And I realized in the event logs for both of these systems, their NTP servers for time, the NTP server went down, or at least the NTP server they were using went down. And it had gone down because the administrators had upgraded that server. They had upgraded the NTP server. And what happened with these two domain controllers is they started generating logs that they had lost track of the NTP server. And all of a sudden, what you started to get was clock drift messages, where the two servers that are synchronized with each other started developing different time. And it was a very, very slow drift. And it took about 3 days for the servers to crash completely. But because of that clock drift on these two systems, they weren't able to sync properly. And after it gets, I think, past like 5 seconds, they just drop the trust between the two, and they go down. And I reverse engineered that. And it was an incredibly powerful thing for me, right? Because we had these meetings where I'd literally sit in the meeting and I'd be blamed for like half an hour. And then I would go to another meeting and I'd get yelled at by management. And then I went into another meeting and I got yelled at by the customer. And they would all say the exact same thing. You're a pen tester, you're a security tester. How can you possibly allow this to happen? Like somehow I coded up a plugin that said crash domain controllers. And, but that was the perception because people didn't understand how things worked back then. So what I had done is I had reversed what had happened, looking at the event logs, and I saw that there started being clock drift, and you started seeing alerts. The clock drift had gotten to the point where it was unrecoverable, and then they shut down. And I remember pulling all the event logs, taking lots of screenshots, creating a report, and then I had like my 5th or 6th let's yell at John meeting. And I went into the meeting and I had the full report, and I had PowerPoint slides because I live in PowerPoint. I've always lived in PowerPoint. And I went through what actually happened. I said, we upgraded the NTP network time protocol servers on Wednesday midnight. And then at Wednesday midnight, you start seeing clock drift messages on these two servers. And then you can see how the clock drift goes further and further and further apart. The NTP server that they had hard coded at the time wasn't set up, wasn't there anymore. It was a different IP address. I laid out absolutely everything. And I was expecting like people to say, geez, John, we're sorry for yelling at you for the past 3-4 days. And none of that happened. I remember once we walked through exactly what had happened, the administrators were like, oh, we'll go upgrade that configuration. And they upgraded, and all of a sudden everything started working again. There was no I am sorry. There was no congratulations, good job. None of that. It was just basically the butt chewing stopped. And that was my reward. And I think that there was a lesson to be learned there. And this is something that I carry forward, is to understand that people make mistakes. And at Black Hills Information Security, it's almost a given at some point in your career as a penetration tester, you are going to crash something. You are going to screw up. And the important lesson to learn from that is understanding how it happened and trying to take steps to make sure that it doesn't happen again, but also not necessarily taking the customer's word for it, that your scan actually crashed the system. This was a hard lesson to learn, and I was jaded for a long time, and I was actually hurt, and I realized that that's just human nature. People don't like to admit that they're wrong, and whenever you point out that them blaming you for something was incorrect, they'd like to bury that and move on. And I decided not to be bitter about it anymore, but just kind of understand that that's the way things go. So let's talk about permission, right? So I've had this happen in a couple of different tests, but the one that I'm talking about now is interesting because this is one of the first times this happened to me. We were doing a scan, and site-to-site VPN between our customer and one of their customers went down while I was scanning. And yes, I'm sure that you have seen this before. All of us have seen scans actually crash systems. And there was money that was being lost for the customer. And whenever you're talking to a customer and they start talking about bringing in attorneys and having a conversation with their legal team about damages, that's the point where you start getting a little bit uncomfortable. Whenever they ask for your errors and omissions insurance policy, that's whenever the butt pucker factor just starts going off the charts, right? So I had escorts out of the building. I had 2 security guards that escorted me out in the middle of a test. And I was able to talk to one of my friends that was on the customer security team. And the two VPNs were checkpoint VPNs. And my friend was super cool. And he's like, yeah, come on in late at night. We went through the logs and we started going through the logs on the VPN. And while we're going through the logs, it hits me that I'm really in trouble. Not just a little bit of trouble, but I was really in trouble because I didn't get a signed permission document. I had the sheet and I was waiting for someone to sign it, but we had a presentation that I had to get to and we were in a hurry. My flight was delayed. So we basically moved right to my presentation, kicked off the scan. So start the scan, then move on and do the presentation, but I didn't get them to sign the permission to test memo. And I realized at that point that damages I'd probably be responsible for, because that permission to test, if you do it correctly, it says that damages may occur and that the organization that you're testing will not hold you liable for those damages because that's part of security. So we're trying to research this, and all of a sudden my will to figure out what's actually going on is now increased because the service is still down. The VPN was still down. They couldn't get it to come back. And we started looking at the VPN logs, and it's a duplicate VPN configuration found working with the newest VPN configuration, and then invalid certificate error. And then it would say duplicate VPN configuration found working with the newest VPN configuration, no invalid certificate error. And it was doing that like thousands of times. And we had discovered that at the exact same time that I was testing, one of the administrators of the VPN had gone and just clicked and dragged slightly a VPN node in Checkpoint, and it actually duplicated that VPN node. And because it was the newer VPN node, it went with that one, but the certificate didn't carry across. And that's why the crash happened. And we were able to sit down, delete the VPN node that was the new one, went back to the older one, and then everything came back up. And there was still confusion as to whether or not the scanning or my testing had done this, even though there's no plugin in Nessus that says duplicate create a duplicate Checkpoint VPN configuration. That's not a plugin that Tenable has. I'm 100% certain on that. And the thing that I kind of learned from that is don't be afraid to dig. You've got to fully accept that it may be your fault, because it is going to be your fault at some point. You're going to crash a system. It is going to be your fault. And you need to be able to accept that reality. But the number one concern is not covering your butt. The number one concern anytime you're doing anything like this is to try to figure out what went wrong and work with the customer to get things better, right? So always get permission, because you're going to crash things. And if you don't have that permission, all of a sudden it starts looking like illegal hacking at that point. Even if they let you in the building and they gave you a badge and they signed a contract, you always should get permission to protect and indemnify yourself. Because I remember being on the phone with my wife at night when the crash first happened. And I remember I was in tears. I thought that was the end of BHIS. I thought we were going to be out of business, because if we caused a crash, they decided to sue us. They wanted to know our insurance policy. It isn't just, I could continue pen testing, but as soon as you have an insurance claim against you, all of a sudden now no insurance company is ever going to insure you. And if you can't get insurance, you can't do pen testing. And that's a fear that every single pen testing firm that I know of is constantly dealing with at all times. You will fail a lot, a tremendous amount in IT pen testing and IT security. And I would encourage you to embrace that. I think it was Matt at the last DerbyCon was talking about, you go to a lot of these presentations and you see the people that present, people like Ed Scotus or like me or Eric Conrad, Seth Meisner, and it just looks like amazing geniuses, right? Like, look at these brilliant things that these people are doing. What never makes it into the presentations are the tremendous amount of failures that we encounter. And I think that becomes a fundamental differentiator between a good pen tester and a bad pen tester. And for me, that fight against failure and constantly, I guess, embracing failure, I don't know, but failing and trying again, failing and trying again, failing and trying again, it basically goes back to eccentric consulting, right? If you failed at something, they actually encouraged you to continue to try. They wanted to make sure that if you made a mistake, whether it was, using a controlled substance in college, or having a bad quarter with grades, or whatever that kind of angst or that struggle that you had to overcome was, that you overcame it. And I realized years and years later that Anderson Consulting and Accenture, they weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they were looking for. And they had a very good job and a very good eye at being able to detect these people that were able to work through adversity and like persevere on the other side. And that's a consistent theme. Whenever you talk to pen testers, like our pen testers, I know I'll have pen testers working at 3 a.m. Tomorrow morning. I don't like it. But I know that that's what they're going to do. I'm not pushing them to work that because of their workload, but they can't let little failures or little problems go. They keep itching at that little scratch, or they keep scratching at that little itch in the back of your head that there's something there. There's always something there. And I like to use this example. Rick Wisser, who's one of our testers, he had this remote telnet service. I think it was like Polycom system, or like Polycom type system. And he found a way to dump memory. There's an exploit to dump memory off of the device. And he went through and he was reverse engineering the memory to find an exploit, or reverse engineer the memory to find the default password for the device, or whatever the password was. And just tremendous amount of work went into this, and he wouldn't give up on it. And then finally, when it was all done, he had actually found the password, and it was like something like password 1234. It's not exactly something that you get, super excited about, but the process of not giving up and failing constantly and then having some success at the end of it is a trait that has to be present in you. And I do not know how to create that trait in somebody with training. It seems to be, and I could be wrong, that it's built into some people. They encounter adversity and they basically push through it, or they just die trying. And that's not exactly a good character trait to have as a human being. It's a great character trait to have as a pen tester, but as a human being, it tends to make you obsessive compulsive. And these things tend to be at odds with each other. On one-upsmanship, I still fight this. In fact, this just happened in Orlando. I felt awful. A very good instructor friend of mine was teaching a very long series of days at SANS. And he's telling me the story and he's all excited, and he comes up and he's starting early in the morning and he's doing a boot camp and tonight, and then he's doing Net Wars on top of it. And he says, this has got to be some type of record for the number of hours taught at a SANS conference. And I immediately jumped in and I said, no, I think I still hold the record. I started teaching at one SANS conference like 6 years ago at 7 o'clock in the morning for lunch and learns with Birds of a Feather, taught through lunch at Stephen Northcutt's management class. And then I taught evening boot camp for SANS 504, gave a presentation. And then the other nights I taught V-Live. And with V-Live, I would teach until 10 o'clock. So I was literally teaching from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock at night. And then I taught 2 days at the front, 2 days on the back. And I felt like an ass as soon as it came out of my mouth. I don't know why I do that, but it's like some of us in this field, I think what's driven to try to get around that whole entire obsessive compulsive that we have, that fear of failure, is we fall into the trap of feeling like you have to be the best, have to best the people around you, right? You'll hear stories all the time like, well, we once hacked this very large bank. And then someone will be like, that bank was nothing. We hacked a bank this big. And it's not just me. This is something I see a lot of people do. And it's just like, I would say within the past 3-4 years, I'm starting to get tired. And I don't, after you've broken into so many banks, after you've broken into so many organizations, it's no longer the super rush that you used to get. It's merely something that you do, and it's like a drug. And after a while, that drug starts going off, and you still have a lot of people that treat it professionally, that work through it. And we'll talk about this more in a slide coming up a little bit later. But you get into these weird competitions with other hackers where it's fights of esoteric knowledge. Like, what's the weird command line parameter that you can use to do X, Y, and Z? And you're always kind of like thinking, oh, well, this is weird. No one's ever done this before. And you save it in the back of your head for the next time you get into a hacker geek fight. You can pull this, this card out that maybe no one knows. And some things that started learning me. First, if you're looking at people like Ed Scotus, if you're looking at people like Hal Pomerantz or Bill Stearns or Chris Brenton, and you can even go down for me like the people like Seth Meisner and Eric Conrad, who are new instructors, same generation as me, these people are all smarter than I am. And I'm not saying that as like a false sense of humility. These people are legitimately much better than I am at IT. And the thing I love about the people that I just listed out is they don't ever get into those competitions. They're more helpful. And I'm trying to emulate them more and more, and more importantly, trying to stay away from the people in the hacker culture that are all about the exploits and living the life of the hacker, because I'm tired of it and it doesn't help. And it also doesn't help people that are getting started in computer security. And I was definitely part of that group. You go ask any SANS instructor, you go back like 10 years ago when I first started, it was this constant battle of one-upsmanship. And there was a bunch of us that were doing it. And I realized it didn't improve any of us. We didn't get better. And we need to find ways to get better and try to help each other out without it becoming this weird game. So don't ever do this with your coworkers. Don't ever do this with people in the community. More importantly, don't ever do this with a customer, because if you do this with a customer, it's always going to come across as you being a complete jerk. There are techniques, there are things that you can do to kind of deal with a problem customer. But if you're ever crossing swords and trying to talk about who knows more about what, the customer is always going to win because they're closer to the metal, they're closer to the applications, and more importantly, they're the ones signing your checks and inviting you back. So even if you beat them and you're like, I just showed them that they were wrong, they hate you. You're not coming back. And this is a lesson that I think every pen tester needs to learn, whether they have their own company or they're working for somebody else's company. I would also recommend that you start small. I can't stress this enough, but we have a lot of people, we have a whole bunch of people who are really brilliant and they're starting out and they're like, I want to present and I want to get my name out, but I don't have anything really elite to do. The majority of my career, if you go to the webcast, if you do the presentations and the videos that I've done, a tremendous number of them are on simple topics, basic things like Nmap, AV bypass, command line interface on Linux and Windows. And if I look at the views of all of my quote unquote basic videos, they dwarf the really advanced elite topics. And that is a lesson that I learned a long time ago, because I remember there was somebody who were crossing swords, right? And one wizard, another wizard, and they were talking about how many people had seen their video of doing some elite 0-day exploit thing that they did. And they had like 50 people that watched their video. And I had a video that was like intro to Linux command line and it had over 100,000 views, and they freaked out. And they're like, why is it that people are watching your video whenever it's lame and it's very basic and it's lame? And like my super wizard video, hardly anyone's seeing it. The reason is there's this tremendous need in the industry because there's so many people that are coming into IT security that are just getting started. They want and they crave those basics. And if you can be that person to give them those fundamentals and those basics, that is a beautiful place to be for a variety of reasons. It's a beautiful place to be because you're improving the entire state of security. It's a beautiful place to be because those people are now finding out that there's not a bunch of jerks in IT security that constantly tell them to RTFM. And that's ultimately what a lot of people in this industry do, RTFM, or the other one, and I don't want to rip on the training or anything, but the whole thing of try harder. If somebody asks a question, that's a jackass thing. Don't do that. That's a horrible thing to say. The best thing that we can say is, let me help you. And it could be argued, well, people have to struggle to learn. Yes, but people need to have the basics and foundations to even learn how to struggle properly. If they're asking basic foundational questions, then we need to help them, or at least point them in the right direction. And telling them that, oh, you can Google that, telling them that to RTFM is horrible, because they don't even know what to Google. They don't even know what to look up. So we want to be IT professionals that are helpful in this industry, and not a group of people that are merely just trying to prove to other wizards that they're an amazing wizard. And that's a hard transition for a lot of people to make, because when we're trying to impress people, and we could say we shouldn't, but we do, we're always trying to impress the wizards, the people that are the city on high, and we need to get past that. So far too much. So a long, long, long time ago, I woke up, and it was actually 10 years ago. And I realized I had to teach a SANS class from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And I had to work on 2 penetration tests, and I had to finish a book all on the same day. And I realized at that point 2 things. One, I was doing too much. And I also realized that I was sucking at everything. My scores in SANS, my class took a huge nosedive that day. And this wasn't just one day, it was just a string of days. And I wasn't scoring well. And so I wasn't doing right by my students at SANS. And for the V Live students online, I had just gotten done teaching for 9-10 hours, and then I had to teach online to them. And they were getting like the leftover, barely warmed up with a microwave version of John Strand, giving a presentation on like, ARP cache poisoning. And my scores cratered them. And the tests that I was doing, and I'm not proud to admit it, it was basically I was just running a scanner at that point and going through the motions, and I wasn't even doing the level of work that I should be doing. And once again, this is not anything that I should be telling people, right? You should be telling people, oh, I'm awesome, I do everything awesome all the time. No, I sucked. I was doing a horrible job at it, and I wasn't proud of who I was. The report that I submitted to my customers, I was not proud of the report that I submitted. The book information that I gave in to the publisher, they ended up kicking it back, and they were like, this is horrible. I was rambling off. It was bad. And then my teaching at SANS had suffered. And you can do that as a pen tester very easily, because it's very simple to take a standard 8-hour day as a pen tester and not give up, and then work another like 5-6 hours that day because you refuse to be beaten. Or the other thing that happens is you're doing the penetration test, and then you get success, and then these endorphins flood you and you can't stop. You've got local administrator, you've now got the ability to pivot off a system, you found a password list that had a bunch of databases and a bunch of applications and passwords. You can't go to sleep because the pen test is just now starting, right? Now you're looking for the sensitive data. Now you're trying to get to main administrator. Now you're pivoting around the environment, and it's so much fun, and it's flooding through your body, and you're drinking Red Bull, and you're just going to keep going. But even if you're doing that, you are slipping in your quality. That's when you start making mistakes, is when you get tired, you get over caffeinated, and that's whenever it becomes something tragic. So VHIS was born. My sister, who's there in the middle, we don't have any pictures of my sister on the VHIS website, which we need to remedy. She's putting the flower on me. My sister is like my Dumbo feather. She proofreads everything I write. She didn't proofread these slides because she just had a baby. And if there's typos, please understand it's my fault, but she usually proofreads those things. But she's my Dumbo feather, so I can write slides, I can write chapters in books, and I can write reports, and I can hand it to her, and she can make me look less dumb. And she does a very, very good job of that. And then I hired Tim Tomes, who's the surprised-looking gentleman right here. And Tim is so incredibly important to everything at BHIS. We're still privileged and honored to work with him as a subcontractor this day. And I'm not going to like sugarcoat it. Tim's a pain in the butt. His commitment to quality is off the charts. He just refuses to compromise ever. And that's what made him amazing at what he does. But that's also what made BHIS amazing. And then Ethan, we've actually had Ethan for a long time. He was an intern, and I don't talk to Ethan nearly as much as I should, but he's just done amazing research and way smarter than I am. Hired Joff Thayer, and Joff is Joff, right? You guys maybe know Joff as a SANS instructor, and Mike Perez, who took over the day-to-day operations. And with all of these people, what I want you to understand is they filled a gap that I was a failure at. My sister filled the gap, and I was a failure at writing. Tim Tomes filled the gap because I didn't have this commitment to quality. I had this propensity of being lazy. Ethan filled the gap in brilliance. You get stuck in something, and Ethan would pull this magical rabbit out of his hat. And Joff just brought this amazing charisma to the ability in working with our customers, and the technical brilliance being coupled with it. And then Mike, organization and running a company and starting out a company, we would have failed without Mike Perez. And understanding that it's okay to have failures, and it's okay to augment those failures and have your peers work with you is a good thing. And it's a hard thing to wake up and realize that there are areas that you cannot do because of time, or your skill sets and then augmenting that with your coworkers or with the people that you hired your company is a humbling experience, but it's something that almost all of us have to go through. And there were growing pains. So whenever I moved back home to South Dakota, I left Denver and we moved up here, and I had $25,000 in moving debt on credit cards, and we had no money. I was teaching for SANS, and that was a silver lining in all of this. I was teaching for SANS, and SANS was doing its best to take care of me. And but whenever you teach or you do a gig, you don't get paid right away. So you could have a situation where an organization owes you $30,000-$40,000, but it's not going to come until next month. So how do you feed your family? So we had this 1990 Chevy Lumina, and it was the family vehicle, right? And we also had a red diesel pickup. Those are the two vehicles that we moved up to South Dakota with. And we found some mouse poop on one of the seats. And I decided I was going to put a mouse trap, and I caught a mouse. And the next day we found some more mouse poop. And then I put in another mouse trap, caught another mouse. And then I put down the sticky traps, and I put some cheese in the middle of it. And then I had 4 mice caught. And no matter how many mouse traps we put down, we kept catching mice. It was nonstop. And we eventually started getting a bit spooked because that's a lot of mice to catch. And we found mouse poop, and we got kids, and no one wants that. So we took the car in, we traded it in, and we traded it on a Hyundai. And can't remember what type of Hyundai. It was like a black SUV. And like as soon as we bought it, it got rear-ended. And then it was in the shop, right? And then we were driving our red pickup truck, and I slid off the road with my family about 2 miles down this dirt road from my house. Really, really super icy conditions. It was really, really cold. And we went off the road, and it got wedged in trees, and I had to walk back home. We had no money, right? I had a tremendous amount of debt. We didn't know how we were going to make our ends meet and even paying for our house. And I'm walking home with my kids, and they were small. And Eric and I had to carry all of our children. I had my daughter up on my shoulders. She was bundled up in a blanket. Erica was carrying my oldest son. And then I had our youngest son in a baby carrier up front. And the kids are all crying because it's -10 out. And we're walking home. And it wasn't like blizzard wind or anything like that. It was just bright, sunny, and cold. And we went back home. And the night before, I hired Tim Tomes. And I remember sitting and talking with my wife. We had no money, we had no car. Literally, we walked home and we had no vehicle at all. And I remember thinking I was going to have to call up Tim Tomes and say, hey, look, that job offer that I made you, you put in your 2 weeks notice. I can't hire you. And I was devastated, and I just couldn't do that. I honestly could not do that to Tim. So we pushed through. And I remember we were late on our house payments. We bought a new car. My parents fronted us some money. And here I am trying to start a business. Here I am, a SANS instructor, and I have no vehicles. I have a tremendous amount of debt. I just hired my first employee because the amount of work on the horizon was something that was going to bury me. And there was plenty of money in the future, right? My family was going to eat, but it was so long. It was like a year of not knowing how I was going to feed my family from month to month to month, because we fed our employees before we fed our family. Now it's not that bad. I have a family that are ranchers, and we had meat in the freezer and things like that. So we never go completely hungry. But there are absolutely growing pains. If you try to start up a company, if you try to do this on your own, do not expect this to be easy. And whenever I tell the story about how to start a company and do these things to people, it's very, very common for people to kind of freak out and basically not want to do it. And I don't want any of this to come across as don't do this, but I want you to understand this is hard. If you try to go out on your own, which I cannot recommend it enough, expect to starve, expect to be hungry. I gave this presentation at DerbyCon a long time ago, and it was how not to suck at pen testing. And it was presenting on all the horrible lessons I've learned. Don't just run a scan, try to get caught, write great reports, listen to what recon and scanning. And almost all of these things I have failed at. And out of all my videos, I think it has one of the higher hit counts. And I feel like an absolute fraud because I'm talking about these things as a definitive individual saying, these are the things you should do. But what people don't understand, and I kind of mentioned it, but I didn't mention it strongly enough, is every one of these different lessons that I talk about is all born out of sucking at pen testing. understand that when we started doing this, whether it was in Guardians, Black Hills Information Security, IO Active, all these different companies years ago, we didn't have templates. We didn't have standards. We didn't have, the shoulders on other people to stand on. And Ed Scotus and the people were great big brothers and sisters to me. But honestly, there was a lot of lessons to be learned, and they were hard lessons to learn. And a tremendous amount of me feels like a fraud for talking about how not to suck at pen testing, when in fact I had done nothing but suck at pen testing for an extended period of my early career, and we needed to get past that. So I'd also recommend that you don't go back to the same well again and again and again. It gets really easy to get lazy and do the same things, the same fish, the same password, the same attack, the same exploit. And then you have to ask yourself, what happens when this particular exploit goes away? And this is another hard lesson to learn, because when we're trying to identify these vulnerabilities and we fall into the same ruts, we're not doing our customers any services. So we started trying really hard to break out. Like if we got success like spring 2018, what else could we do after that? And the point was, after you get success, getting in a system, getting corporate assets, getting domain administrator, whatever the customer set up your goal to be, if that happens quickly, go back and provide value and keep going back. Don't ever get lazy and say, oh, I'm done. I'm going to go play video games right now. That imposter syndrome is huge. A long time ago, Ed Scotus interviewed me for Guardians. It was the scariest interview of my life. He bought me like 2-3 beers, and I was getting pretty well far gone. And then he goes, well, how about I give you the Guardians interview right now? And I'm like 3 beers in, and I'm a lightweight. And he basically just started giving me these questions. And they weren't, I don't want to say they were hard questions. They were thought questions. It wasn't an issue of getting the right answer. Ed wanted to see how I thought through. So if I didn't know, he'd say, talk it through. And then I'd start talking it through. Well, months later, they asked me to join. And there's a whole nother story with that. And I didn't. And still to this day, I regret it, because in that moment that Ed Scotus and Mike Poor and Jimmy and Jail and Jay Beal and all these people were like, yeah, we want you to come work with us, I didn't. Because when I'm looking at those people, when I'm looking at like Matt Carpenter, when I'm looking at Kevin Johnson, when I was looking at all these people that were on the roster in Guardians, I wasn't them. I was nowhere near good enough. And, that never really goes away. You always kind of feel like you're not good enough. And I still have this, like the lesson here is I still am an imposter, but I'm trying really hard to not be. And I think that constantly trying to earn the respect that your peers in the industry has given you is something that you should never stop doing, and you should never take that for granted. You have new people that are just getting started, like the last Orlando conference. I had people come up and, hey, I just got started in security on your videos. That's what keeps me moving, is hoping that these people learn something new from me to get started. Back to defenses. This is another thing that I was embarrassed about. And I started talking to Chris Gates, and I started talking to Dave Kennedy about it. And I've been lately, I've been noticing that there's a number of offensive people that are arching back, and they're going into blue. At first, whenever I started working on active countermeasures and I started working on different things like active defense, harbinger distribution, I thought I was giving up on the red team, and that's not true. I all of a sudden was interested in the defenses, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the offensive things that you do, you see variations of the same themes again and again and again and again, and you realize after a while that offense is really easy. Defense is hard. And after seeing someone like Chris Gates from Carnal Ownage and seeing, Dave Kennedy and having conversations with these guys about how, we've done that for years and now go back and try to help make the world a better place on the defensive side, that's not something to be embarrassed about. To be honest, that's the trajectory I'm seeing a lot of really amazing offensive pen testers take. And there's nothing wrong with that. And to be honest, we all may arc back and go back into the offense again, but there's nothing wrong with going back and forth between red and blue. And that kind of teaches me we shouldn't be putting down offense or defense, because it doesn't improve the state of security at all. So moving forward, kind of wrapping things up, I do see the needle moving. Security is improving. And one of the things I love seeing is whenever I make a new slide or a change in 504, 6 months later, we start seeing it in our tests and it's implemented. There's nothing like these big earth-shattering events and changes, even these huge exploits that hit and these worms that hit, they don't actually fundamentally change people's lives on the day-to-day operations and what they do. It requires this constant pressure. And constantly pushing. Don't ever expect that you're going to have a presentation that you give to your coworkers, and then all of a sudden you're going to say, I see the light. Yes, we are now going to patch our computer systems. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to be this constant pressure. You're never going to have someone say, oh, you're right, I was wrong, and I feel really bad about the errors of my ways. That's never going to happen. Don't expect that. But if you apply that constant pressure, and you keep pushing a little bit constantly, whether it's in your company, whether it's in webcasts that you give or presentations that you give, you are moving this massive block of computer security forward in the right direction. It just takes a tremendous amount of time. And I'm now at a point where I can look back on my career of 18 years, and I can see where that change has happened. And I can see where there's things that I pushed on in the past that are actually making an impact moving forward. And it's cool to see that. But if you're just getting started, don't expect that to happen right away. It takes forever. You know, I was in my truck after it wrecked, and I'm walking back to my house, and I'm wondering, what am I doing with my life? This was 10 years ago. I'm not making an impact. I'm moving forward. I'm not financially caring for my own family, but we kept moving forward. And that's what you need to keep doing in security as a whole. A final note. I get asked all the time, how do you get into penetration testing? How do you get into security? How do you get into incident handling? How do you get into the blue team or the red team? And the only thing I tell you is that there's no straight roads to get here. It's not about reading a book. It's not about taking a class. It's not about getting a certain certification. There's no straight road to get here. And there are no straight roads when you arrive. So you're constantly confronted with these amazing, just dizzying amount of options and paths that can take. Don't be afraid to take a path. It's not the wrong one ever. You're always going to learn. You're always going to struggle. You're always going to fail. And if you're always failing, then you're pushing. If you find yourself never failing anymore, then you've truly failed because you're not growing as a human being or a pen tester or a security professional. And with that, that's it. I think I have some time, absolutely, to stick around for questions. I think Jason's still on. I feel like I'm a NASCAR driver. I'm associated with SANS, Black Hills Information Security, IONS, Active Countermeasures, Security Weekly. You can find me on Twitter at StrandJS and John at Black Hills InfoSec. And yes, that is in fact a picture of me in a clown costume. So I'll hand it over to Jason. I'm happy to stick around if other people are willing to stick around. I know that some of you have jobs that you have to go to, so go get to it.
So, John, we got a couple questions that are come in so far. I'm going to ask from Lewis. From your perspective as a small business owner in the industry, what one thing has changed for the better, and what one thing has changed for the worse in 15 years?
As far as being a business owner, the one thing that has changed for the better is the quality of people that we have. Understand that trying to find someone like a Tim Tomes or a Joff Thayer and Ethan at the beginning, and I left out, there's a bunch of people at BHIS now, but those are the core that started it up, and they developed the heart and soul. It was hard to find those people. Now there's a lot more talent. That's one thing that's better. The downside is there's not enough. The amount of organizations that need testing, the amount of organizations that don't even know where to begin in computer security is staggering, and we cannot keep up. A lot of people find it weird that Dave Kennedy and I are close, and I invite him out to MyCon, and I give his company a booth at MyCon, and we have a booth at his con, and we're competitors. How can that be? We should be fighting each other. No, it's like a game of Hungry Hungry Hippo with thousands of marbles. We cannot keep up. And I think that that's the one thing that I've seen change is we do not have enough qualified security professionals. And at SANS, we're trying to train them as fast as we can. And it's hard to keep up. That's the two big things that I would say have changed for the better and for the worse.
All right, John, I'm not sure if this is a question. I'm reading it right now. Only 2 years in the industry, first pen test at a bank, only realized after the pen test was done, I could have passed a hash and captured domain admin, and thus the journey began.
And that statement, I think, is really representative of what it's like for every pen tester. You never really remember the pen tests where you're successful, but you always remember the pen tests where you weren't, and you're always going to be fighting those. They're going to be in your head till the day you die. You're going to be constantly thinking that through. And the only thing I could say is, man, you got to let it go. And I know that's stupid, right? Because I haven't let some of these things go, but we've got to try to let those things go. And I guess at the end of the day, if the organization's overall security posture improved as a result of the testing that you did, then you were successful. You didn't fail. But yeah, you're constantly going to be chasing those dragons that you missed.
John, this one may sound self-serving, but is a question from the audience. Having completed SANS 504, a great course, what would you recommend for a one-man internal IT security team for a small-sized company? Would you go security 560 to see what more is done from pen test side, or more of a forensics blue team style course?
So it depends on what interested you. Remember, 504 is a purple course. We're underneath the pen testing curriculum, and that's where our home is, and that's where my heart is. That's where Ed's heart is, and Jason, is a big part of that family. And with 504, it's also blue because a lot of the things overflow into security or the cyber defense curriculum and forensics. So if you feel that the defensive side really tugged at your heartstrings, I would recommend 511 with Seth Meisner and Eric Conrad. If you really feel like the offensive stuff really kind of like was calling to you, then I'd recommend looking at 560. That's what I would recommend, those two things. And if the forensic side, the memory forensics, there's memory forensics classes. Hard drive forensics, we have hard drive and system forensics classes. So I'd find where it's like a Ouija board, right? Wherever it's taking you, wherever you find yourself drawn for articles and things like that, go there. If it's a cyber defense, go to 511. If it's the offensive, go to 560.
What are your thoughts on developing a specialization within pen testing? For example, web app versus being a jack of all trades pen tester?
I think you're going to have to be a jack of all trades to start. If you want to get into pen testing, be a jack of all trades, and let's just like the Ouija board. If you find a specific technology is really calling out to you, like hacking toasters, and you have a lot of toasters in your house and you're hacking them all the time, then go into specializing in hacking toasters. That's great. Do that. The other transition is if you're a developer in a certain technology, it's very easy to transition into becoming an expert in that area for penetration testing. Rich Mogul is a great example of that. And his company was called Securosis. I can't remember what it's called now, but he's actually an expert in cloud technologies, and he's now a security expert in cloud technologies. So that was an easy step for him to actually take. Georgia from I think Shiva. She's got involved in like mobile devices and pen testing and that. She got some grants for DARPA, and that became a natural progression for her. Same thing with Zook at Zymferium. So we've seen these areas. Oh, and also Grim. Grim has a bunch of people that are big into automotive stuff, and they basically have kind of morphed those people into being automotive hackers. And that's just one of the things that these different organizations do. But you can see where people had deep skills in an area and they transitioned into becoming an expert. A lot of pen testers, you become a jack of all trades, find something that's interesting, and then dive into it.
Yeah, they're all great questions, but this one feels useful for all the people. Do you think it's a good idea for experienced security pros to reverse course and go back into mainstream IT based on what they've learned in InfoSec from meth?
I would say that there's absolutely value in that. I like that. That's kind of like the reverse course of Dave Kennedy, Chris Gates, Movix, myself, kind of reversing and moving it back into the blue. However, two things against it. I think it sounds great to go back into IT, and I have often wanted to go back and get a degree in security, not in security, in IT architecture or computer science or computer engineering or something like that. But there's two things that are going to stop you from doing that. The first thing that's going to stop you from doing that is your skills are rare and in demand. It's really, really hard once you've done that, once you've done offensive, once you've done security, locking down systems, to simply go back to a general IT practitioner. You're almost always going to get sucked back into it. The other thing is we have a tremendous need for security professionals right now, and it's kind of all hands on deck. So for me personally, I would implore, please don't do that. We need good security people. Stay on this side of the wall and continue helping us fight the good fight.
And John, I think our last question for the day will be, do you recommend any CTFs for someone who is CTF challenged?
CTFs, there's a ton of them. Jason, do we have the link for the SANS Ultimate Pen Test poster?
The Ultimate Pen Test poster. I can drop it in there, yeah.
Yep. So Jason's going to get you a link, and on the back of that poster, we have this mind map of all the different CTFs that are out there. Just start finding them and working through them. Just start working through them. Also, on the commercial side, counter hack challenges, net wars continuous. I don't know of any CTF in the world that's better than that. And the reason why is that CTF will meet you at the level that you currently are. and it'll raise your skills incrementally, and it's great. And I know that that's somewhat self-serving. It's a SANS thing. I get that. But there's lots of free and open source alternatives, and Jason's going to share out this link to the SANS Ultimate Pen Test poster that you can look at, and you can find all these cyber ranges online and get started working through them. The other one I would recommend is the Holiday Hack Challenge from CounterHack. Every year, Ed and his team, they release these holiday hack challenges. And just as a little secret, like CounterHack and NetWars is really just a way to pay the bills so they can do more of these holiday hack challenges because they're just that awesome. So go check them out. And what's cool is if you don't even know where to begin, if you go through the previous holiday hack challenges, there's walkthroughs, and you can follow somebody else's walkthrough to get you up and running and get you through the challenge. It's kind of like cheating in a video game, but that's okay because you're going to learn something in the process of doing it.
John, do you have any final words?
Nope, that's all I got. Thank you very much for spending time with me this afternoon, and I'll see some of you in London, and I'll see some of you at a SANS class sometime soon. If so, come and say hi.
All right, Carol, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, John, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Later, everybody.